Well, hello everyone. Thanks for joining this session on AI in the newsroom. And first of all, let me introduce you my colleague, Patricia Georgiou from Jigsaw.
Hi, I'm Patricia Georgiou. I'm the head of partnerships for Jigsaw, which is a nonprofit part of Google that focuses on how we can use technology to tackle democracy threats, in particular using AI. So I'll come back to this a bit later.
Thanks, Patricia. So before we start exploring how newsrooms are already experimenting with AI, the work that has already been done through several case studies that I'd like to share with you today, and also sort of have an idea of what is the potential that lie ahead of us. I'd like to give you a little context on where this effort sits at Google, where we work on this, which is the Google News Initiative. The Google News Initiative, as you know, has been launched a year ago. We've celebrated last week, actually, in Mountain View, the first anniversary of this effort, which has received a commitment of $300 million, was launched last year, and which is built on three distinct pillars. The first is to elevate and strengthen quality journalism, which is also for us, part of it is to fight misinformation and support organizations and partnerships that have been created to fight misinformation all around the world. The second pillar is to evolve business model to help the news industry secure revenue from subscriptions in particular. So that comes with the creation of specific tools such as subscribe with Google. And then the last pillar is to empower news organizations through technical innovation, which is actually what we're discussing today, AI being part of this effort. There's a huge awareness of how costly and difficult it is for certain newsrooms to adopt, develop, integrate new technology. So part of our effort is to support this transition. So we do that in different areas. First of all, helping newsrooms find new ways to tell stories. So that's an effort that particularly concerns data journalism. You've seen yesterday the release of the data journalism handbook by EJC. Other areas such as VR, another way of telling stories in the digital area. Also new ways to reach audiences, and we've developed specific tools such as AMP pages to help the media reach and engage their audience on mobile, for example. Another aspect is to secure the communication of journalists and their newsrooms and to protect media all around the world. So that's also Patricia's team work, and she'll tell you more about it later. And then the fourth pillar is to leverage artificial intelligence, which we consider, and we'll talk about it later, a very central piece of the DNA of Google right now, and also a potential new frontier for journalism looking forward. So last December, together with the London School of Economics, we announced a project that LSE has formally launched earlier today, Journalism AI, which I strongly recommend you to read about on their website, on their blog. This effort is an effort to help newsroom understand more about AI and to also figure out through research and training what are the needs for newsrooms and the way they are already using this technology all around the world. So strongly recommending you the reading of this blog post that went out earlier today.
So Google is an AI-centric company, which means that we're using artificial intelligence at the very core of our product development. Last year, our CEO, Sundar, posted a blog where he explained the principles behind our usage of artificial intelligence. And the first one of those principles is to be socially beneficial. What that means for Google News Initiative is that we want the technology, and especially AI, to be beneficial to the news ecosystem. We use AI at Google for many of our products. If you, as part of your journalism work, are using Gmail, Maps, Google Earth, reverse image search, and YouTube or Translate, as well as Google Docs, you're already using AI and machine learning.
But the news industry itself has already started experimenting and looking very seriously at AI and machine learning in general. If you look at this recent study that has been published by the Reuters Institute, you discover that 59% of newsrooms and respondents already consider AI to improve content recommendation. They're already using it for the sake of for their user to be more informed and to get more recommended content. They also use it not only on the editorial, on the user engagement side, but also for business reasons, since 39% of them use it to improve commercial optimization, which is to say ad targeting in particular or dynamic pricing. So it's already in the thinking of newsroom to a very strong extent. And probably the reason why it is taken that seriously is when you look at this other study by the Boston Consulting Group, AI and machine learning appear to be useful and powerful for media at each level, each step of the value chain. When it comes to content supply, I mean, it's a BCG phrasing of thing, but it's like the use of source and the documents that are used for journalists to investigate, for example. They can use, and we'll go through this later, intelligent document recognition, for example, using AI to better spot stuff in documents that are then used as sources. But also, so from the beginning of the chain up to viewer engagement, for example, as mentioned earlier, for example, customer segmentation or creating specific recommendation engine to help readers figure out context, for example, or background to a story is reading about. So in that regard, it's promising for the industry. At Google, the way we see it being profitable for newsrooms is around three different angles. The first one, which is the one we are actually actively working on right now, especially in my team at the News Lab, is to increase efficiency with newsroom tools. This idea that AI and machine learning can help you reduce the time you spend performing very mundane tasks that are time-consuming, that don't really add a lot of journalistic value to content, and time that the journalists could spend doing much more interesting, rich, value-adding stuff. We'll see examples of this later on. The second aspect of application of use of AI we see, maybe more of a business-oriented application, is how to create long-term value from archived content. So this idea of a long tail way of seeing at things, like this old stuff that used to remain in the archives of the media, and then suddenly, because it's been surfaced in a smart way by machine learning or intelligence, artificial, gain a second life kind of thing, and can be, for example, monetized for a second time. And then the third aspect, which is, as a former journalist, I must say, the most exciting thing for me, it's because it's connected to investigation. It's about reporting stories at scale and using the power of machine learning and artificial intelligence to, in particular, identify specific patterns within a huge amount of data or within huge data sets. And we'll see examples of that because there are many. Some of them have already been awarded very significant prizes and prestigious prizes for that. So when it comes to increase the efficiency of newsroom tools, there is one first and priority, I must say, experiment that we have conducted in the range of area that we are looking at to help journalists perform tasks that don't add much value to their work. There is one that most of you are going to recognize as an interesting one, which is the transcription of interviews. I mean, you being a journalist or being a journalist student, you know how much time you spend transcribing interview, which is, and I recall that from my time at AFP, both extremely boring and time-consuming, that the number of hours you spend transcribing interview, and crucial for the quality of your reporting. It's because you do extremely good transcription that your reporting is accurate, and then you can build trust with your readers. Because if you do it too fast, or if you do it in a way that is not proper or correct, you put your work at risk. So the privilege we have at Google is that we have a specific API that belongs to the Google Cloud system. It's called Natural Language API that recognize language when you speak out. So it's already integrated within a couple of our tools, and you can actually use it in your daily life. And the first way we discovered journalists were solving for this interview transcription is through, it's a pretty unusual use case for Google Doc, but then they use Google Doc. It's a Brazilian journalist that told us that the way he transcribes interview when he doesn't have time is that he put his recording machine on his computer, play it on Google Doc, and get the transcription through the natural language API. So I'm just going to show you this potential hack, but that explains how we can base our work on this API. So you get to Google Doc like this, and there's this specific feature that is called voice typing in the tool, in the available tools. So of course it's a demo, though it might not work. You choose your language, which I put here English. Then you click to speak. So what I'm going to do is that I'm going to read out the police blog post, and then you'll see how it works. So the beginning of the post is artificial intelligence. Artificial intelligence, machine learning, and automation are already having an impact on newsrooms all around the world. So that's the base from which we work, which is this API. And then what we've started doing is working with partners, and especially the Washington Post, to build a specific tool that could allow journalists to immediately and automatically transcribe interview based on files, actually, files where they would have recorded the interview, whether they are voice, audio files, or video files. So it's still an experiment, but the way it works so far is that it helped reducing the transcription time by 80%. There are other ways, other angles we use to tackle this transcription problem through, for example, the DNI Fund, helping startups that have started doing work in this area. In particular, this startup founded by a former ABC journalist, Jeff Kaufman. Startup's called Trent. I strongly recommend you to look at it. There are several videos on YouTube that explain the way it works. It's pretty impressive, and it's also very much focused on a use for broadcasters, and works in several languages as well. So another use of another API which can help journalists make quicker decisions or help them make editorial choices in a way that is increasing their productivity is the Google Translate API. And that's a use case that has been developed by Vice. You know, Vice, they have 500 editors all around the world working in 18 different languages. So all this very rich content that is produced sometimes is used by editors in other countries, but it's tough for them. Wow.
So much support.
Yeah, enthusiasm. Yeah, so for the editor, or for example, the of a certain country newsroom, sometimes it's useful to understand what his counterpart in another country has published, but he doesn't necessarily know the language. And he doesn't really know if it's worth asking a journalist spending a lot of time translating it properly. So it's useful for him or her to have, at the first glance, kind of an idea of what the story is about and how easy or useful it is to localize it to his own country or her own country. So through this use of the API, the editor can quickly read the first sentences, the first paragraph of the story, understand if it's a good story for his market or not, and then ask a journalist to perform the translation in a way that is relevant to the audience. So what is interesting in this example also is that it's not a way to use the API to do the work of a journalist, because translating properly a story and adapting it to a local audience takes a lot of resource, time, and editorial thinking. So it's the proper work of a journalist. But it's more, the tool is used by the editor to just make the decision of translating or not, and help save time, translation time for his journalists. So these are what we've seen as interesting examples of how AI and ML can be used to reduce the time that journalists spend on tasks that prevent them from doing more interesting and more value-added things. So the second area, as I said, is to sort of surface content or help create smart archives of content to give a sort of second life, especially a second potential monetized life to editorial content. So we've run an experiment with Hearst newspapers in that regard to use to use again the more sophisticated way of using the natural language API to analyze the text, an article, and automatically tag it so that it can be surfaced again in the archive. So reduce the time journalists spend tagging articles. So you can actually pretty easily try this online. There's if you want to look at it, the Cloud Natural Language API web page allow you to do a little testing. So if we take again the blog post, you take the first paragraph, for example, you copy and paste it, then you put it in this try box, click on analyze, and then it analyzes immediately which are the entities that are used in this paragraph and help you classify it, as well as measuring the sentiment that is vehicled in this text. So see how fast it is and how quickly you can get a big amount of content tagged, and then more easily surfaced if you wanna give it a second life. It works with text. It also works with images. So I'm based in Paris, and we have in Paris, in the Google Paris office, the lab of the Google Arts and Culture department of Google, which is the department that take care of relationship with the art and culture institutions and partners, and try and help give a better, quicker, smarter access to content in the art and culture area. So one of the projects that has been a focus for the teams there, and that you can actually find if you download the app of the Google Arts and Culture, in the experiment section, you'll see this experiment, which is called Life Magazine Tag Life. The idea is that Life Magazine had 4 million photographs that they shared with us, with a problem, which was that none of these photographs had metadata on them. So they had this huge content that was a bit like, a testimony of like crucial decades of American and global history, celebrities, sports, politics, but they couldn't properly navigate it because there was no metadata. So the team at the Google Arts and Culture Lab, what they did is that they trained a model, they trained to put in parallel and to understand the relationship between an image and a label, a tag. They did that on search, on image search, and then they applied this model to these 4 million photographs so that the machine and the robot can understand what was on each image. So now when you get to the app and you type a category, a label, a tag, you get all the pictures that the robot has understood was part of this thing, like here, astronaut. So you get a long list of tags like this, and you can navigate through all these archives in a much more fluid and in an interesting way. Which is interesting also because you see the content. You also see sometimes the bias that the robot took in understanding what was on the picture, as well as the bias as sometimes some photographers from Life magazine had when they wanted to give an illustration of certain abstract concepts. So strongly recommend this experience, which is powerful and a great way to access this content that would have been more difficult to access another time. And then the third aspect, which is really fascinating, is how AI can help investigative journalism, more explicitly how it can help reporting stories at scale. So the idea is that how can you use machine learning to identify specific patterns that couldn't be identified by a human because of the amount of data is too large, and then creates stories or specific resources for journalists, such as this one, that couldn't have been created without it. So this is a partnership we did with ProPublica. The idea was, the problem that the team wanted to solve was, the ProPublica team wanted to solve was, there is no not exactly an archive, but a database of hate crimes in the US. But there are stories about all these crimes, but there is not one place where all these stories can be accessed in an easy way. So the work that has been done was to use Google News resources and all the stories there on Google News, and use a robot to go through this database and surface all this story, and have this big amount of data not only processed, but then stored in a way that is easily accessible for journalists who are investigating these hate crimes. So this project is called Documenting Hate. It's easily accessible, and it's also a project that has constant iteration. So you can see the new version of it and how vivid it is and useful. Another example that is very interesting because it also use an extremely widely available signal, but thanks to the machine learning and the use of this technology, this signal is used in a way that it helps surface a phenomenon that is illegal and that is difficult to trace for human being, which is overfishing. So it's a partnership we did with 2 NGOs to build a platform that is called Global Fishing Watch. The name of the NGOs are Oceana and Sky Truth. So it's an NGO-based, not like a media-based partnership at the beginning, though it helped journalists write about it. You'll see that later. So the idea was, you want to investigate overfishing, but then if you look at it with your eye, you have a scale issue. If you look at this picture, for example, that shows in China the moment when, after a fishing moratorium, fishing boats go out at sea to fish. When you look at it with the single eyes, you see that. But then if you zoom out, you see that. And if you zoom out again, you see the magnitude of the issue. So how can one human being, and even several human beings working together, can really take into a proper consideration the scale of the problem. It has this phenomenon, which is extremely important, especially in Southeast Asia, had been investigated in a more traditional way by such an organization as ICIG, the organization that did the Panama Papers, who they had used more traditional data journalism methodology, asking sources, investigative government, going through database, but it took them a lot of time, resources, a work that can be more easily done by a machine, and also help uncover a bigger picture. So that's the project and the way it was done. What is interesting, it was using a signal that was widely available, which is the signal that the boats are sending. It's a compulsory thing. When you have a boat, you have these signals that go out. You can't prevent it. But the machine was able to recognize the signal, put it together with the limits and the frontiers of the fishing activity all around the world, and understand exactly where the boats that were doing illegal fishing or overfishing, where they were coming from. And it helped substantiate very important litigation case against specific companies in specific countries that were engaging in this activity. So it was also, for journalists, a way to report about the story at scale, such as this story in the New York Times, and also the consequences of this overfishing. In this Reuters story, is an analysis of the impact on the environment of such phenomenon. Another example of this reporting at scale and the way machine learning can help identify patterns in a big set of data is this BuzzFeed story that most of you probably have heard of because it won awards as well. It's a story about hidden spy planes, and it's interesting because, again, it's a widely available signal that planes just send. So it really makes the robot and the machine learning like the plane spotter of the future and understand the story at a bigger scale than a human.
So another way that we can leverage AI is to use it in order to protect news as well as their audiences. So like I was saying earlier, my team, Jigsaw, is based in New York, and we focus on how we can use technology to protect democracies from several threats. So that means leveraging AI to protect the voices of journalists, of activists, and of civilians, basically protecting free speech and free press. So where is press freedom threatened today? Everywhere. At various degrees, obviously, but press freedom is at risk everywhere. Obviously, if you want to silence a news organization or a journalist that you disagree with, whether you're a public or private actor, you can do it the old-fashioned way. You can storm their offices or physically arrest them. Sadly, we see this all the time. I know if you made it to Maria Resa's talk yesterday, she's a journalist in the Philippines that has been arrested several times. But there's another way of doing it, which can be sometimes even easier and much cheaper, which is doing it online. There is a way of taking down an entire website with just a few clicks and a few dollars, and potentially impacting millions of people, elections, and causing a lot of damage to the news organizations. It's called a DDoS attack, meaning a distributed denial of service. The way that it works is that you basically flood the server of a website with so much malicious traffic that the server becomes overwhelmed and it just goes offline. So your website, your news website, is no longer accessible. When my team started working on censorship techniques, we traveled to various countries and interviewed independent news about what they were seeing. So, for example, in the Thailand political crisis, we were seeing a correlation between what was happening on the ground and what was happening in the digital world. In this case, during the December political crisis, websites were being taken down by DDoS attacks. We also saw it happening in Ukraine around the Euromaidan. We saw it happening in Hong Kong during the Umbrella Revolution. So we started trying to understand the amplitude of this problem. Was it specific to these countries? So we built a tool called Digital Attack Map to visualize the magnitude of the problem. And we saw that these DDoS attacks happen everywhere, all the time. You can see digitalattackmap.com. This is the snapshot of what the DDoS world looked like on April 1st. And sadly, it's not an April Fool. So, in fact, these attacks happen all the time, and they can be very, very costly. On average, a DDoS attack will have a cost to the news organization of $250,000 per hour. And in fact, it can take up to 3 hours to know that this attack happened and 3 hours to actually protect yourself from it. So in average, if you accumulate these 6 hours, it can be between $1 to $2 million. And that is not to mention the impact on your readers. These attacks happen especially at crucial moments when there is, for example, a demonstration happening on the ground, or there are elections that are about to happen. For example, in 2017, around the Dutch elections, the two main websites that readers and citizens go to have information about political candidates, those two main websites were taken down by DDoS attack just a few days before electors went to the polls. And we see it happening everywhere around the world. Now, Google itself is constantly under attack, also by these types of DDoS threats, and therefore we have invested a lot to protect our own infrastructure. So we decided to make this technology available for free to news organizations, as well as to election monitoring websites and human rights organizations. It's called Project Shield. And if you're a news website or journalist organization, you can apply and we will whitelist you to have this infrastructure protection. In this case, we use AI so that from each attack, we're learning and we're getting better and stronger in our defense systems. So this is the first case of using AI to protect newsrooms and journalists. The second case that we've been focusing on is online harassment. Since I arrived in Perugia, I've been hearing way too many stories of journalists being harassed, especially online. Some of them are in this room today. They have all told us horror stories of how social media, tech platforms are actually used to amplify waves of hatred and harassment and cyberbullying against them. And it can take many forms. It can be direct personal attacks, insults, hate speech. It can be doxing, where they basically have access to your personal phone numbers or address, and they blast it across the web so that people can actually physically threaten your integrity. Sometimes it's even more sophisticated in that they create a porn video with your face morphed into it, or just fake images that will basically threaten your reputation. And obviously, this is very intimidating, but journalists are very brave and they overcome this because they can even consider it as part of their job. And they continue doing their brave work of reporting on the news, uncovering corruption scandals, and basically reporting the stories that they're being threatened in order to silence them. The problem is that you cannot expect the same degree of resilience from an ordinary citizen who's just going on the internet to read the news. And unfortunately, that's what they also see all the time. Tons of toxicity, whether they are on Facebook or in discussion forums or in different parts of, 4chan, 8chan, any basically online conversation. It's really hard today to be not intimidated by this toxicity. And it gets even worse with intersectionality, where basically the fact that you belong to a specific minority group, whether it's your gender, your sexual orientation, where you're from, your race, your ethnic or political belonging, all these are leveraged to harass you even more. This is an article that The Guardian had published about their editors being harassed, but everybody can experience that today. Today, it's really hard to go online and have a civilized debate. And as a consequence, people start avoiding these public conversations. They end up going into filter bubbles where they're only going to have a conversation with people they already agree with because they're afraid of all this cyberbullying. Or they end up self-censoring and basically not sharing their opinions anymore. But this is not possible on the long term. For a healthy democracy, we need a healthy debate. And this is not, if we're not going to be able to have a civil debate and share different perspectives, we're not going to be able to move society forward. Now, why is that online toxicity relevant to you beyond the actual case of harassment against journalists? Well, that's because journalism is a central part of that discussion. People don't think about topics in abstract. They actually start thinking about a political question or a society issue when it's surfaced by the news. In fact, they react to what the news are surfacing, the stories that journalists are telling them. And therefore, these conversations happen in the comments section of news articles. I was talking to many journalists. One of them told me that he defines his job as being in the lighting business and in the heating business, meaning that he surfaces a story and he sheds light on it so that people learn about it, but then he's also trying to provoke a reaction from them. He's trying to get them to have an opinion on it and potentially act on it. And again, these conversations are happening in the comment section of news articles. Now, obviously, news publishers can value that. They have told us that for them, it's a meaningful ally of both hearing what their readers are thinking about, also for journalists to have a dialogue with them, to keep an ear to the ground and understand what are the opinions that are being put out there. Sometimes it even helps them, find experts in their audience. And it also helps news publishers measure their audience engagement and retain contact with their audience. The problem, obviously, is that moderation cannot keep up. In the online world, you can publish millions of comments in a few seconds, which means that humans cannot keep up. Even if we employ the entire humanity, we cannot review every single thing that is posted on the internet, simply because human people do not scale. But humans can be helped by AI, because AI is specifically a kind of tool that can help you scale. So we got really excited about this challenge. We thought, if we can use machine learning and AI to recognize cats from dogs, why can't we train algorithms to distinguish good comments from bad comments? Can we train algorithms to extract toxicity from comments? So this is the project that we got really excited to do with several publishers. We decided to gather millions of comments from different news publishers, comments that had already been reviewed by human moderators, and then we trained our algorithms to follow the same patterns and do it much faster. So here's a video of the project. We did it with publishers, including the New York Times.
Human society is built around the spaces that we share. The internet was supposed to bring us all together, but many of the shared spaces online are becoming toxic, being drowned out by trolls and by attacks and abuse. I don't see how we can ever move forward together as a society if there's nowhere we can talk about our issues. We can be better than this. We have to be.
I have experienced hateful comments, comments that were discriminatory. And how that sort of fuels me to do my job is that I want people not to experience those things. It shuts down conversation. It ends conversation. The trolls are winning to the extent that they have driven some news organizations to shutter their comment sections. Places like the New York Times comment sections shows that you can have a civic discourse.
Doing it right is hard and it takes resources, but we're about holding that town square open for people and hoping they come in and take part.
Comments are a space where anyone can contribute. They represent the dream of the internet. They're the thing that we hoped would allow us to really share our ideas and make progress. And they're also, in a way, the biggest tragedy of the internet.
When we looked at the comment section of the New York Times, it really just stood out among newspapers for just how incredibly thoughtful and insightful and diverse the opinions were.
Why is it so good was one of the questions we're asking.
And it turned out that they were cracking it by just reading every single comment.
There came a point when we were getting so many comments that we couldn't moderate them with the same kind of quality and the same kind of joy.
They had a limited number of people on the team and could only open comments on 10% of the articles. And that was just a human bottleneck.
Perspective is built using TensorFlow. TensorFlow lets us build artificial intelligence algorithms that find the patterns in data. Patterns like, is a comment toxic, or will the New York Times moderators accept it or reject it?
For me, working with AI, I feel like I'm living in, Star Trek times, where my coworker is a robot and we get along great.
Now, every single top story on the homepage has comments on. That's just huge. And in terms of our business, the best thing that we can do to attract new subscribers is to make them feel connected to us and to one another. The Perspective Project allows us to scale that in ways that we couldn't imagine before.
They give us the ability to communicate with the world.
If you have a place where you can speak of these things that are going on, but without the attacks and the abuse that is way too present in our society right now, that's how we're going to get out of it. That's how we're going to get out of it.
So this is how we build the Star Trek tool. It's basically AI that can help human moderators do their work much, much faster. Basically, it helps extract from a whole pile of hay the few needles or potential needles of toxic comments that the human moderators should be looking at as a priority so that they can remove it from their platform more quickly. So we basically help the New York Times and other publishers build this moderation dashboard where they can, batch approve or batch reject comments that are, treated by the algorithm, analyzed, and then, labeled as potentially 90% chances of being toxic or 10% chances of being toxic. So it helps them really group comments by likelihood of being toxic and therefore having to be removed. So it's called Perspective, and in fact, it's obviously not just for the New York Times. It's a free API. It's a public tool that publishers can use by going to our website, perspectiveapi.com. We are also working on scaling it in other languages. So in December, we announced that we're launching it in Spanish with El País, and we're working on other languages. Since the New York Times has been using it, they were able to multiply by 4 the number of articles that are open to comments. And this is really a very positive trend that is starting to reverse what we were seeing before, which is that a lot of publishers were just giving up on moderation because it was too costly, and they were just shutting down comments and therefore reducing the spaces for public conversations. So we're confident that technology can help improve the quality of online conversations with the collaboration of publishers. The other tool that I wanted to talk about here is something that David touched upon in the introduction, which is helping journalists on the ground use digital security tools. So one of the tools that we recently developed is called, if you can, sorry, this is not working. If you can, yeah. So one of the tools that we recently developed is called Outline. It's a VPN that helps journalists who are investigating sensitive stories, especially in countries where there's a lot of surveillance and censorship of the internet. This VPN can allow journalists to communicate with their colleagues and with their sources in a way that protects them much more from surveillance and censorship. So obviously we don't have time to go through a lot of other tools, but I wanted to end with the fact that we're always eager to learn more about the needs of journalists, whether you're a big newsroom or a small independent investigative journalist. We would love to hear about your experience and your needs and how technology can help you do your work. So if you have any ideas or feedback, we'd be happy to brainstorm and see how technology can help you in or out of the newsroom. We're happy to take questions too.
Thanks. Please go ahead. We'll be happy to answer your questions.
Is it done? My question was, what do you think are the risks that when Google is the one we are depending on as journalists, Google is the one with the power because everything we need is in Google. What are the risks of that?
What do you mean by everything you need is on Google? You mean in terms of? Well,
you were saying that we are using Gmail. That's one of the things, but also Google News is, it's quite big, and we are depending on it. But what are the risks of that if everything is with Google?
No, we take all of these potential risks very seriously. Obviously, the one of the main things that we constantly work on is privacy. So obviously, we're always making sure that our products are GDPR compliant, and we're always looking to have the best privacy practices. The other piece that you mentioned is Google News. In fact, Google News is really just an aggregation of existing sources. So we have invested a lot in making sure the fact-checking ecosystem is solid and sustainable, that fact-check markups are present in the results of Google News, that the content that Google News is sharing is, trustworthy, reliable, coming from credible sources. So we're constantly looking at all the different pieces of that ecosystem.
And also maybe to add to it, what is interesting when you think about the search engine per se and the model of it is like, it's a tool that helps you go through, navigate, surface the open web, like the web in its entirety and its diversity. So I think from our point of view, it's the way to guarantee large and free access to the information and independently.
Thank you. And I have one other question. I read an article about Article 13. I don't know if it's in English the same as in Dutch, but it's a rule about privacy and on the internet, and also about if you can link through other sites. And I heard Google has problems with that because they link in Google News to other articles. How are you yeah, how are you going to do that?
Yeah, I think you're referring to the directive that was very recently adopted. I think it was a few days ago. So yes, as soon as a regulation is enacted, our legal team will gather and discuss all the ways to comply with the applicable regulations. But as a directive, it's still at the stage where it has to be implemented by each country in the European Union will have to basically adopt a regulation that will transcribe the directive in local regulations. So that phase still has to happen until there's actually applicable regulation for each country.
Okay,
Thank you.
Do you collaborate with governments?
Well, we comply with applicable regulations, if that's your question. There is also a transparency report where Google publishes every year the requests from governments. So that's published in our annual report every year. Can you pass the mic on the front row, please?
I was just thinking, I'm a university student, so when you talked about documenting hate, I thought that for our research in jobs, it would be so huge, something like that. So my question is, have you ever thought of applying these kind of tools to instruction, generally speaking, not only to information and journalism?
Yeah, I mean, just to go back to documenting hate, it was not like a 100-person Google project. It really was a partnership with a newsroom that really had the idea and wanted to experiment, which is the way we usually proceed with media. We put ourselves in a position where we empower media and journalists to perform their work, not prescribing solutions to problems. I'm not an expert on what is possible outside of the news industry, unfortunately, but I guess the use of AI is pretty much, not really limited, so it can be applied in many, many fields. And I think there are experiments already in the learning sector. Any further question? Yep.
Thank you very much. Are you going to roll out Perspective AI in other languages in the next months? Can you give
Sure.
us an insight?
Yeah.
What language is one?
So I personally find the language and internationalization problematic very fascinating, because I myself come from a multilingual background, and in fact, languages are really not that trivial. There are a lot of nuances that are very context-specific and that are very local-specific. So, for example, as you probably know, there are various forms of Spanish, and a word that would be completely ordinary in Latin America would be considered a swear word in Spain. There are nuances in every form of language. So, in fact, in order to develop an AI that can recognize what is the meaning of that word in that specific context. Is it, ironic? Is it a passive-aggressive comment? Is it meant to insinuate something? That is really, really hard to detect if you don't have a lot of examples. So the main tool that we would need to build perspective in other languages is a big data set, meaning a lot of examples of good and bad comments in that specific language, and then get human reviewers to review every single comment many times, and then when they agree that this comment is toxic or not toxic, then we use it to train our algorithm. So it's really not a trivial process of just take the algorithm and translate it in 120 languages. You actually have to find a lot of different examples of good and bad comments in that specific language. So to answer your question, it really depends on having partners that are bringing us examples of good and bad comments in their language. So we were able to do that in Spanish with El País. And me as the head of partnerships and my team, we're looking always for partners in every other language so that we can find good and bad examples of comments in a volume that is enough to train an algorithm in that language. So we are working on other languages. Which one we announce in the next months, years, will depend on having these collaborations in place and how much the algorithm can do a good job, because obviously it's easier also to develop the algorithm in a Latin language if you've already started doing English and Spanish versus doing Mandarin or Hindi or a language that uses another type of alphabet. So stay tuned, watch that space. There are going to be more languages, but I cannot tell you right now which one they're going to be. Any other questions? I think we have 1 more minute. All right. Thank you very much for being here.
Thanks.